This is Ahval Online, meeting point of accurate news and free comment on the current affairs of Turkey. Welcome to our podcast series.
Tim Ash, who I'm sure a lot of you know, he's a senior emerging markets strategist at BlueBay Asset Management. Tim, welcome.
Hey guys.
Well, we weren't going to talk about economic growth today because I contacted you yesterday and we had fourth quarter growth this morning in Turkey, but we've been overtaken by events a little bit across the border in Syria. We had 34 soldiers killed, which was an absolute travesty and terrible situation in the country at the moment. And Putin and Erdogan had a phone call today. Seem to be some signs possibly that they're working towards some kind of revolution, but the situation seems to be very volatile. I mean, what's your reading at the moment from a investor's point of view about the situation and a eco-political point of view, let's say?
Yeah, I mean, pretty worrying. I mean, obviously hopes for some de-escalation in the short term. I mean, positive that Putin and Erdogan are talking. But in the end, it's hard to see a resolution that is positive for Turkey, right? I mean, Putin is a hard guy, right? He's not gonna back down easily. Militarily, I think he has the advantage on Turkey, right? He dominates the skies. And he seems to be determined to allow Assad to recapture sort of Idlib and the rest of Syria. And then his focus is going to be on trying to do reconstruction. Obviously, someone's got to back down. And I don't think that's going to be Putin. So for Erdogan, it's a tricky one, right? I mean, either he has to give ground or he has to double down and escalate himself. So no easy options, right? And obviously, if he backs down, many refugees coming into Turkey at a difficult time on domestic politics. So hard all around, right? And on Russia, the risk I think for me is a repeat of the 2014-16 tourism bans. Remember, after the Russian fighter was shot down, I think in late 2014, and that comes at still a tricky time for the Turkish economy. So. It doesn't need the loss of 3 million Russian tourists at this point in time.
No, quite. I mean, if you look at the two economies, I mean, you're also looking at Russia, right? I mean, you're basically saying that Russia's in the strongest position. I mean, the Russian markets were down today. We've got global sentiment turning worse.
They weren't. I mean, they've been weakening all week because ruble anyway, and that's just been global growth, coronavirus, commodity prices, and actually nothing really to do with the Turkish situation. I mean, I don't think people think that there is going to be a situation that is particularly negative for Russia, right? Anyway, that's so it's pretty asymmetric. I mean, Turkey looks in a difficult position. The Russians think they're in a very strong position. And markets seem to favour Russia this time around. Yeah,
and then Erdogan goes in anyway, and of course those soldiers were killed. But there was quite a few events leading up to that. The two sides were hitting each other's positions, etc. But Erdogan continues to order the Turkish military to fire on the Syrians. I mean, the lira's was getting pretty close to the lowest level since the few weeks after the 2018 crisis early this morning, and it's rebounded a bit. I mean, what do you think Erdogan's thinking is? Because obviously he's entrenched there in Syria. He wants to be in Syria, but at the same time, we've got all this volatility at home.
Look, I mean, I think we have to give credit. Obviously it's a very complicated situation, and there's different issues. There's the Idlib situation, there's the YPG issue elsewhere in Syria. But I think on Idlib, at least, I think we have to give some credit to Turkey for actually defending refugees, and obviously Turkey's provide sanctuary for almost 4 million Syrian refugees. So where the West has done very little. So I think we have to give credit there. At the same time, it comes at a pretty tricky time in any event for the Turkish economy. You mentioned at the start, you want to talk about the fourth quarter GDP numbers, which are very positive, 6% year-on-year growth. But I guess the question for the market is how that's been achieved, and it's been achieved, unfortunately, by a repeat of the failed policies of the period leading up to 2018, which is basically overly loose monetary policy, central bank cutting rates too aggressively, and loose fiscal policy. And it's domestic demand driven, and we have the trade data today that showed a 19% increase in imports. So the market, essentially what we're seeing in terms of balance of payments is current account moving from surplus back into deficit. Policy rates are probably too low, and what we're seeing is portfolio outflows and dollarization. So both locals and foreigners are basically telling us that the level of interest rates is not high enough to want to keep lira, and we see continued pressure on the lira in the last couple of months, and the central bank meeting that and state-owned banks meeting it with intervention. What we know is Turkey doesn't have a huge buffer of FX reserves, so eventually time's going to run out. So the central bank is trying to do a very difficult thing. It's trying to cut rates and trying to keep the currency relatively strong with very limited FX reserves. And now, on top of all that, we now have the situation in Syria that is a risk to tourism revenues. The one positive in all this is, obviously, given slowing global growth, oil prices are lower. And as we all know, Turkey is a big energy importer, so that helps Turkey. Yeah.
Taking all this into account then, what should Erdogan be doing going forward, and what do you think he will actually do in terms of the economy?
Well, I think on Syria, I think Erdogan has had this sort of dalliance. He's had his problems in the relationship with the West, obviously since the failed coup in 2016, and maybe also before that, you could argue. But anyway, and he's had this dalliance with Russia in the East. In my personal view, you could dispute it or debate it. Is that Turkey's natural place is with the West?
Yeah.
I've always argued 2/3 of trade, investment, and financing comes from the West. I think what's happening in Syria should make it crystal clear to Turkey that its natural partnership is with the West, with the EU, with NATO, with the US, and it should reorientate back. And it should, this idea. Turkey's bought S-400s. I don't know what it spent on them, $3.5 billion, and it can't use them. How ridiculous is that? That the one place that it actually needs in their defense system is on its southern and eastern borders, and it can't use them. Right? So I think Erdogan should basically put those S-400s on a plane back to Moscow and work overtime to try and get a missile defense system that he can use, and basically that's Patriots from where I can make out. So that's on the Syria issue, and it takes two to tango. I understand that, and many of the problems in terms of the Turkey-Western relationship is from the West as well, right? Yeah. But anyway, more effort to smooth that relationship, I think, would go down very well in the minds of Western investors that are at the moment not investing in Turkey.
Yeah,
the data shows that people are reducing exposure to Turkey, and then in terms of policy, back to orthodoxy. I think
that would be your recommendation rather than what you think Erdogan will do.
Oh, well, it's hard to get into Erdogan's mind. I think we know what he thinks. I think what the interesting thing in my mind about Erdogan is that he's very pro-market, pro-business.
Yeah.
His general economic instinct is this is not Maduro or Chavez in Venezuela. This is a guy who likes to, build roads, schools, hospitals, do deals. Yeah. Very like Trump in many respects, but he doesn't like interest rates. Actually, like Trump as well, right? Doesn't like banks, doesn't like interest rates.
Yeah.
But the general economic stance of AKP has been very pro-market. If we could just get over the interest rate issue, you could create a pretty positive sort of policy story around Turkey.
I mean, one could argue that since the coup and since the introduction of the presidential system, that Turkey's not perhaps so pro-market, and in terms of aligning with the West, Erdogan is rightly or wrongly trying to forge an independent role and a global position for Turkey from his policies in the Middle East, and
it's not working. I mean, let's just not. I think the presidential system has been a disaster for Turkey. People like Ali Babacan would, Davutoglu, okay, they're in opposition now to Erdogan. I think even AKP supporters would accept that the presidential system has basically not worked. I mean, it was behind the crisis in 2018. And it was, the way Turkey operated previously in a parliamentary presidential system was, there was proper checks and balances. Right? And AKP itself was a pretty broad church. When you had people, Erdogan, Gül, Babacan, Davutoglu, there were real checks and balances. And the presidential system, I think, effectively, there weren't enough people around Erdogan who were willing to give him sound policy advice. It was all about climbing up the greasy pole to have a nice position in the presidential palace. And it wasn't really about, telling the truth to power.
But has that situation changed?
Not really, no, I'm afraid.
And will it change, do you think?
Look, long term, I am reasonably constructive on Turkey in terms of politics. I mean, in the end, look, what we are seeing with sort of Babacan and Davutoglu leaving, we're seeing within AKP circles, let's say that's socially conservative kind of political grouping in Turkey, more willing to criticize, be open. I think that's good. I think Istanbul elections in the end proved that Turkey is a democracy. Whatever, I mean, obviously there were concerns leading into the Istanbul elections and the local elections, whether or not Turkey was going a different path. I think the Turkish voters, showed that democracy is alive and kicking in Turkey. So I think that's incredibly positive and encouraging going forward. I think Turks, looked over the cliff and saw, what, presidential system and over centralization means, and I think they want something different, and I think they voted for something different. And I think, so positive long term. Short term, they're muddling through in terms of economic policy, and I worry that the imbalances that drove the 2018 crisis will come back, and there will be another stop. It's timing when that will be, and risks have been building.
When you say a stop, what do you mean exactly?
Well, a repeat of 2018, essentially. A growth that's unsustainable and that creates imbalances that are not financeable, and currency will have to adjust again. I mean, we're seeing some adjustment, so I think that maybe the central bank are trying to gradually weaken the currency to moderate those imbalances. They're using reserves to do that. Maybe they can get away with that, but it seems unlikely.
So, I mean, you have spoken about the reserve situation. I mean, with your comments on Twitter to clients, etc. I mean, and you did mention that a lot of people seem to be looking at the net reserves, which appear to be very low, maybe perhaps in the teens. And then you've got the minus some liabilities, and then you've got gross reserves of over 100 billion. And you didn't exactly rubbish it, but you said that, look, the central bank's kind of right, that the gross reserves are important. And there's a big difference between those two numbers. And if Turkey has to defend the lira, if it came to shove, are you saying basically that Turkey's got a reasonable amount of money to to defend the currency, or are they sort of running out now with all the state bank intervention? I mean, what's going on, do you think?
Well, there's a lot of focus obviously on net reserves, and that's borrowed money, and the net position is pretty weak. But in the end, gross reserves is how much cash the central bank has in its pocket, to deploy to defend the currency. And they've got 70 odd billion, and then 100 billion including gold. So it's a okay amount. I wouldn't say it's reassuringly large. I mean, there has to be a limit. I mean, that's about half the gross annual financing needs. Actually, normally countries would want 100% of financing reserves. So it's about half the level that I think one would feel comfortable with. But, they can survive quite a long time. The problem is when you're beginning to eat into net reserves, or net reserves are going to fall, and then they go negative. You're spending other people's money, and I guess the big concern about what's happening with the reserve level is the lack of transparency. Like net reserve with the use of swaps. I mean, essentially you're kind of moving the chairs around the deck chairs around the Titanic, and it unfortunately reminds me a bit of what's been going on in Lebanon. Lebanon's had a similar situation essentially with their gross reserve position looks fine, but actually their net reserve is probably deeply negative, and it's okay until it isn't, and when it isn't, it can become a disastrous situation. So so I think people just feel very uncomfortable with the underlying story behind net reserves. What's the real position if you exclude swaps? And people don't really trust what's going on behind the scenes, and that's this general lack of confidence in the policy settings.
And like you say, the market, the investors are keeping away, and you've got this like Reuters were reporting a few weeks ago. There's this so-called national team of traders at the state-run banks manning their desk 24 hours a day to support the lira. And I guess this obviously doesn't resonate well with investors. So, I mean, how do you see things panning out in the next few months? I mean, you say Erdogan's pragmatic, he's pro-market, but then again, he's following these policies which are basically leading to some potential overheating again, and then another crunch. When's it going to happen?
That's the $100 billion lira or dollar question. It's very hard to time it, but what we know is Erdogan likes growth. He likes jobs. He likes building things, and he likes credit. And there've been cycles of this reflating the Turkish economy. You could go and you could look at the corrections. So you could look at the period to 2006, the period to I think 2012, 13, and then 15, 16, and then 18. And for me, the cycles are getting shorter, every time. And so, I don't think we're too far away from another significant correction.
So it could be months.
It's more likely to be within the next year than, within the next 3 years.
Right. Well, that should be like a warning for Mr. Erdogan.
Well, what we know, I have to say, what we've learned again is eventually they do adjust, right? Eventually, even into 2018, despite all the foot dragging, they eventually did hike policy rates. Unfortunately, guys like me and you and other people we're highlighting the risks in late 2017 that policy was too loose. They need to hike. If they'd have hiked in 2017 by a couple of hundred basis points, they wouldn't have had to hike by 1,000 basis points the year later, right? And the cost of that was a much weaker currency and recession. So there was a big loss in terms of lost economic output, unemployment, because policy mistakes were basically taken. And I think unfortunately that's going to repeat itself.
Yeah, we have to look at things and say at the moment, perhaps, that there isn't a learning experience going on.
Well, unfortunately, we are seeing a repeat of, mean, look at the credit, the sort of 6% GDP growth number today. Look at the credit growth numbers. Look at policy rates. It's the same story.
Yeah. Just finishing up, Tim. I mean, you did say on Twitter, I think it was yesterday, about Turkey being in Syria, like you say, supporting the refugees. I mean, some people would argue that they're also supporting some Islamic groups over there and trying to extend their influence in the country. But Turkey's doing more than any other country in NATO, and NATO should be supporting them. And maybe that caused a bit of controversy on social media, but are you sticking with that view that NATO should come to Turkey's aid?
Look, I've covered Turkey a long time.
Yeah.
And as I said, Turkey's position is in the Western Alliance. It's in NATO.
Yeah.
And my personal view is the West's not done enough in Syria, right? I mean, Syria is a disaster. Right? Let's not beat around the bush. And we're all responsible. Right? The West's approach to Syria has been a disgrace, right?
Yeah.
West's approach to Syrian migrants has been disgraceful as well. And in the end, bottom line is Turkey is hosting almost 4 million Syrian refugees at a huge cost. I think we have to hold our hands up and say, thank you very much, well done. And I do think in the end in Idlib, Turkey is the only country that is actually defending refugees.
Yeah.
I mean, unfortunately, I would hope that the West would step in and help Turkey out in this situation.
What can the West do? I mean, you've got Russia there. What can the West do?
Well, again, if Turkey's prepared, if Turkey, I mean, I think much clearer statements to Moscow.
Yeah.
I think, if Turkey, decides that S-400s are not a very good idea, I think that, there's plenty of countries in NATO that have Patriots available to deploy. I think they should help Turkey out there. But I don't. Again, it's totally my personal view. But it's very easy to criticize Turkey. But in the end, people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones, and people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones. And I think we haven't done enough in terms of helping migrants, and Turkey has.
Yeah. Are you a great fan of Turkey, Tim? When are you over next? When are you going over next?
Well, actually, I'm in Turkey this week coming.
Oh, really? Meeting with officials and businessmen and.
Yeah, the usual tour of duty from my perspective. So I'm really excited to be coming. And my wife is coming with me as well, and she loves Turkey, so she never needs an excuse to come to Turkey. Most of my best friends are Turkish. It's a great country. It's got challenges, I mean, I think, as I said in my tweets, I mean, whatever you think about Erdogan personally, I think Turks have, need to be commended for hosting 4 million Syrian refugees. 4 million. Yeah. I mean, Germany has 1 million, and it's a much richer country. So, I think we need to do more to support Turkey.
And despite all the political pressure, like you say, this has happened. Erdogan's taken a bit of a hit, and he's still doing what he's doing. Yeah, but very challenging situation. Yeah. Well, thanks very much, Tim. It's great to have you on again. Cheers, and have a wonderful weekend. Yeah. Yeah, I enjoy it. Cheers, man. Bye. Thanks. Bye.
You can follow Ahval News Online podcast series through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, and Spreaker. All you need to know about Turkey is here for your ears, mind, and attention. Thank you for listening to our podcast.